Do you sometimes wish that life could be more enjoyable? Do you wish that you could be happier? Do you wish that you could feel more love? There's a secret to getting all of these things. And that secret is that you don't exist. Now, I know that is quite an extraordinary claim, and I'm going to defend that claim and explain how it is not only possible, but the only real truth out there. Now, and also, you're going to get everything that I mentioned before at the beginning of the video and more. You can achieve infinite love, bliss, connection with God, Spirit, Brahman, whatever word you want to use to describe the divine. And you can have a far more amazing life than you can possibly imagine. You have no idea right now what the possibility is for a human being. And I'm going to do my best to describe this, how you don't exist, and how that is actually the key for you achieving and accomplishing and obtaining all of these things that you want, like happiness or love. All of these normal human things that you want. The key to realizing this in this lifetime is to realize that you don't exist. Now, when I say you don't exist, that sounds like an undeniably false statement. But we have to be very careful about what we're talking about when I say the word you. Because there is more than one you. And that sounds like an extraordinary claim. That's just a small side note. You think of yourself as a human being. You have a name, you probably have a job, or you go to school, you have family members, you live in a certain country. You have an identity that was built up ever since you were born. You were socialized and essentially cornered to start to believe that this was you, that idea, that person, that is what you are. And that's actually not the case. And this has been described in various different spiritual and religious contexts for thousands of years. But it is still not very widely known in the Western world, or even modern day China or India, where a lot of these teachings originated, like Buddhism, Zen Buddhism, Hinduism, or the Vedic tradition. And basically where I'm coming from is I've been seeking spiritual enlightenment for about 6 years now. I've used meditation, I've watched hundreds and hundreds of hours of videos, read books, listened to audiobooks. I've read ancient text, listened to ancient texts, like the Bhagavad Gita or the Upanishads. Those are some really good ones. I've learned about other cultures, such as the Aztecs and their notion of God. And a lot of this ties into a concept that is known as non-duality. And what non-duality says is that there is only one thing in existence, and that is the self with a capital S. So, I'm bringing in a lot of concepts here to describe what we're talking about. But the first thing is to really get a grasp on what the ego is. The ego is your false identity. It's what you think you are. It's what you've been taught to believe. Everybody you've probably ever met in your life believes that they are the ego, their own individual ego. They believe that they are a human being having a limited existence on planet Earth. And to an extent, yeah, that is true. But we're not talking about surface level information anymore. We're talking about the metaphysical ground, the foundation of existence. And ultimately, yes, that is non-dual. There is one thing, and that is God, the higher self, the self with a capital S. There are so many different names for this. I've even watched a video where someone I like to watch, he compiled a video with over like 70 names for God and then just described all of them and what they kind of mean. And I might link that in the description below. But anyway, I'm going to take a quick look at my smartphone to go over my notes and start to go over what it is that we're talking about here. So these are the key insights that I've had after meditation, listening to hundreds of hours of videos, reading books, etc., and also using psychedelics, which are very powerful tools used if you're using them correctly in a spiritual context. They can really speed up your understanding and experience of spiritual enlightenment. So anyway, let's get on with it. So I've described ego. Now we need to describe God. God is the consciousness within all living entities paired with all things that exist in what we typically conceive of as the material world. It's not just one or the other. It's God is everything. And it's good to start off here with God is consciousness or pure awareness. But God is also everything that is created by that awareness. Something you probably don't realize or have ever heard is that consciousness creates everything that you see in front of you. If you want to have a fun debate, find a Western philosopher and ask them if something can exist outside of consciousness. I actually have a good friend who has a PhD in philosophy, and I was describing my views on consciousness and the nature of reality, and he was saying that time and space exist outside of consciousness. But where's the proof for that? See, you can't get away from this direct experience of consciousness that you're having right now. If it's not within consciousness, we have no idea that it's anywhere, that it even exists. It's ridiculous to think that something is outside of consciousness. But sadly, that's the paradigm that most people hold. So anyway, we know a little bit about what God is. Now we need to talk about the devil. You hear about this, especially in Christianity. The idea of the devil or Lucifer or Satan. Really, in a more developed spiritual context, the devil is your ego. The devil is what keeps you away from God. It is that identity that you hold so dear that you think is unquestionable. That is what drives you to do every action that could drive you away from God. There's a common notion in Buddhism that talks about an experience of no self. And as you can probably get, that lines up with this whole you don't exist idea that I'm talking about. The no self idea is that your ego self is an illusion, it's a fabrication, and it is ultimately not real. The thing that is real in Buddhism is essentially like a void nothingness that is conscious. So no self is no ego. When you have no ego, when you reach that point, you have no self, and you've achieved enlightenment. That's what Buddhism teaches. Now, another thing that I'm going to get to, which Buddhism doesn't actually believe in souls very much, but essentially God is a collective soul or a collective consciousness. Soul kind of works. It's not a perfect word. There are a lot of different connotations that people have about the idea of a soul. Essentially what we're talking about here is pure consciousness and nothingness. paired together because those are the same thing. So the self with a capital S that I've talked about is God. It is everything that exists. It is all consciousness. Anything that could ever be imagined. It is total, complete. Now let's cover the idea of death. And this also comes into play with the idea of an afterlife. Almost every religion or spiritual tradition has a concept of an afterlife or something that will happen to you after death. Now, some have two options, like in Christianity, there is heaven and hell. And I do realize that those could both be possibilities, but really what it is death is the dissolution of your ego. And in some spiritual traditions, and some people hold the idea that death is the complete and total dissolution of the ego, where the ego is completely destroyed and lost and will never come back again. And that in itself is where you come to be in complete union with God, is when the ego is lost completely. Now you can have ego dissolving experiences in this lifetime through meditation, through psychedelics, through yoga, it even happens to some people randomly. Just maybe some stressor or strange life event can literally cause a sudden enlightenment. And that enlightenment is that person realizing that their ego is a false identity, realizing that they are not the ego. But it goes beyond realizing. They actually experience what it is like to not have your ego. Now, I've had these experiences, and many people have. The difficulty comes with sustaining them and reaching a high level of ego dissolution. Because there are many different levels to enlightenment or ego dissolution. You can have a Satori experience, a sudden enlightenment, and then you might be in that state of consciousness for 2 weeks or so, and then it can just go away and you're back to your normal life. But you still have the insights that you gained, and you still know of the possibility, which is a good thing. But typically, meditation is very good for creating a more sustained experience of no self. If you meditate for years and years, psychedelics are more helpful for having that sudden realization of no self, of no ego, of self with a capital S, and of God. You can literally realize that you are God if you meditate to a certain point and come to a certain still point in your meditation. You can open your eyes and be fully conscious and realize that you have created everything in your entire life that you've experienced up to that moment. But it's not the little you, not the ego you that created that. It's the real you. And you can realize in that moment that you have always been God. You have always been inseparable from the Creator, but you were under the illusion that you were not the Creator anymore. And I don't really understand why. I mean, I kind of do understand why we do this to ourselves. Why us as God would want to live a limited existence. Because ultimately, for God to be everything, every possibility, to hold within it all things, it also has to have a direct experience of being limited. That's one of the things that comes along with omniscience or infinite knowledge. You hear that idea when God is spoken about, especially in Christianity. You hear the three things: omnipresence, God is everywhere, omnipotence, God is all powerful, and omniscience, God knows all. If God did not know what it was like to live in a limited existence, it would know everything. So we talked about death. Now let's talk about the afterlife, or what comes after death. That is, there are many different concepts around this, but they all are really coming into one thing, which is union with God. And that is heaven, nirvana, infinite love, infinite bliss, reconnection with infinite consciousness, merging back into full union with God. Now, I'm not discounting the possibility that there is a hell. And honestly, to tie in with what I was just saying about omniscience, God would also have to know what it is like in a direct experience to be in hell if he were to really be omniscient. He would have to know that. But I do see, from what I have learned, that ultimately at the end of this journey, if there is ever an end, there might not be, but some traditions say that there is an end, or at least a temporary end, where you come back into full union with yourself, your true self, as God, and you are no longer a separate embodied being living in limited consciousness, a limited existence. So at some point, from what I've learned, I really feel strongly that you will, no matter what you do, no matter how many atrocities you commit, you will one day be fully merged with God again. And Hinduism actually talks about this in a pretty interesting way. And I learned this in the Bhagavad Gita. So Krishna describes that there is Brahma's night, and that is when all things, all beings, all of existence comes back into union with God. It all comes back into it, and everything comes to an end. But it also talks about how there is a time when everything comes back into an embodied physical existence, or a limited existence, or the universe is recreated again. So it kind of touches on that idea in an interesting way. Quickly, I want to say that yes, you certainly can have experiences of no self, or self with a capital S, or God realization, or higher consciousness. There are many different words to describe similar things. You can have this, but even for the most advanced spiritual practitioners, they usually only experience this for a limited amount of time, and usually, I would say probably always, they're never fully there. There is an exception, though. There's a version of Samadhi in Hinduism. Samadhi is essentially, it's kind of like that no ego union with God, but it's got its own nuances to it, that word. But there's a type of Samadhi where a person can willingly leave their body. It's like it's like a form of spiritual suicide, but they're not like killing themselves necessarily. They've just realized what they are, that they are infinite love and bliss, and they are God, and they merge back into that and leave their physical body at that time. Bet you didn't know that was a cause of death. Yeah, so it's really interesting reading about ancient spiritual texts and just seeing how far people have gotten. And I do want to say, so you might be thinking to yourself, all of this just sounds crazy, Brandon. Like, how can you prove that any of this is real? I've never heard of any of this happening before. You're wrong. You've heard about it happening in multiple times. It's happened in many different cultures across different spans of time. And I will name some of the popular ones, the popular people in spirituality who reached a very high state of enlightenment and consciousness. Jesus Christ, Buddha, Krishna, Muhammad. Those are probably the most popular. So, you've heard about them to an extent, at least one of them, I'm sure. And you've probably heard about miracles they were able to do, walking on water, healing the sick, turning water to wine. They were born of a virgin mother. And Jesus Christ wasn't the only person to have these types of stories around them. I know for a fact that Krishna and Buddha also had similar things. I'm not sure about Muhammad. I don't know a whole lot about Islam at this point. Although there are great Islamic sages as well, and they've reached very high states of consciousness as well. Almost any tradition, I would say, there are true masters. Probably all traditions. There are true masters. And that comes to say there is a universality of this experience. It's not held within one religion. And the more that you learn about spiritual enlightenment and begin to do practices yourself, the more you'll see that there is truth in every religion. And that sticking to just one religion might not be the best if you're really wanting to reach the highest levels of consciousness and get some of the things I said at the very beginning of the video. If you want to be as happy and experience as much love and beauty in this existence on earth as possible, this is the only way. It's a spiritual path. That's how you get that. Living a solely worldly existence, trying to make money or have sex or have friends or even spend time with family, none of that compares to spiritual enlightenment. None of it compares at all. Now, those are all good things, and I'm not discouraging you from doing all those normal, fun, and good things. But I'm just telling you that there is an experience out there to be had that goes beyond what you can possibly imagine. And it is better than what you can possibly imagine until you've experienced it. Then once you experience it, you realize, wow, I've only experienced like 1% of this. But truthfully, consciousness is infinite, so 1% of that doesn't really work. The math doesn't really work. So you just, there's always more. There's always further to go. Because God is infinite. Consciousness is infinite. And it's a beautiful thing. But yeah, just one deep spiritual experience is enough to change your entire life and give you not only a whole new outlook, but probably change a lot of how you act too. Now I'm going to read directly from my phone for a minute to a writing that I had done for this video. And that is, the dissolution of the ego is where you find the real you, with a capital Y, is in fact the fabric upon which everything exists. So you are the fabric upon which everything exists. You are the consciousness that everything exists within. You are the nothingness, the void that everything exists within. This is similar to how space-time is the fabric that the material world exists within. At the most fundamental level, you are conscious nothingness. This conscious nothingness is everywhere, knows all things, and ultimately holds full power over the physical world. Yes, this is God, and yes, this is you. You can discover this for yourself by performing self-inquiry based upon the question, what am I? The trick to arriving at the correct answer is to keep in mind that anything that changes is not the real you. You are not your physical body, as nearly every cell in your body has been replaced since your birth. Not to mention the impermanence that death brings to the physical body. You are not your thoughts, as these constantly change as well. You are the awareness that witnesses thought, emotions, the body, and the physical world. The awareness is immortal. You are immortal. The Hindu and Vedic tradition posits that Brahman, the supersoul within all beings, a specific notion of God, is Sat Chit Ananda. The word Sat means existence. The word Chit means consciousness. And Ananda means bliss. At your core, you are infinite existence, consciousness, and bliss. The more that you seek spiritual enlightenment, the closer you come to realizing and experiencing this in this life on earth. But hey, there's nothing to sweat. This is the ultimate final destination for you no matter what is done. You will eventually, possibly after many lifetimes, merge back into full union with God. And quickly, I'm going to get into some insights that I had on some very profound and deep high-dose trips on magic mushrooms. So the first one is good versus evil. So in one of my trips, I became fully conscious of how God views good and evil. I don't want to say fully conscious, actually. I became conscious of it. There, of course, could be more to become conscious of because God is infinite. But good and evil in the way that we perceive them as humans on planet Earth, it doesn't really equate with how God views things that happen here. God views good and evil as essentially the same thing. Everything happening here is creating more sophistication. If everything was good, it would be quite a boring existence. So, yes, evil, when you're at a low state of consciousness and you're in a human body and having limited consciousness, when you're having that experience, something that happens to your ego structure that might damage it, or something that happens to your mother, or something that happens to some kid in Africa that you watch a video about. It might make you sad. It might make you wonder, why is this world so evil? But that's not how God sees it. Do you really think if God was fully loving, he would allow evil to exist? You might say that God allows free will, but ultimately it's really because God does not see it as evil. When you get to a certain point, a certain state of consciousness, you will realize that everything that you thought was bad or evil is perfectly fine. It's perfectly fine in that state of consciousness. Now, of course, once you come down from that state of consciousness and you come back to your normal state of consciousness, you're going to feel like these things that you were tolerant of in a high consciousness state, you find them distasteful again. But it's just part of being in a high consciousness state that you become so open and loving of every experience that could possibly happen. One example I can give is, I was on one of my mushroom trips. They're known for causing nausea in people. And I was about an hour into my trip, and I was feeling it very strongly, my trip, and I had to throw up. And I remember experiencing that. I threw up, and I loved the experience. And it surprised me just how different you view something depending on which state of consciousness you're in. When you're in a high state of consciousness, if it's high enough, you can literally love anything, accept anything. when you're in a low state of consciousness, you can turn your nose up at almost anything as well. So that's one insight that I had. And this other one, I talked a bit about the God realization, but I had a direct experience of this myself. Again, this was on a magic mushroom trip. And I became aware that everything that I had experienced in my life up to that point was leading to the point that I would realize again that I am God. Not Brandon Rowe is God, but that essentially it's like saying God is God. God realized that he was God, or she was God, or it was God. And that's what God realization is. It's not your ego realizing that your ego was God. That's where a lot of people get a bad taste in their mouth when they hear someone say something like, I'm God, or I experienced God. They're like, that's not possible, especially religious people. They'll say, like, that's impossible, you're deluded. But the truth is that we are all God, and we're just having a fun little experiment here on planet Earth where we come and we have physical bodies, and we're born into a chaotic world where there isn't much harmony at times. And we have this experience, and I do thoroughly believe that we are here for a reason, and we chose this experience. We chose to be experiencing what we're going through right now. We wanted to experience difficulties. We wanted to experience setbacks, and we also wanted to experience the positive things in life. But there's a lot to learn by going through life on Earth. And ultimately, just if I can tell you one thing, it would be I hope that you do look into spiritual enlightenment. And I wish you the best of luck at that. And I know that if you put enough work into it, it will undoubtedly be worth it. It'll pay back more dividends than anything you could have ever done. It is the thing to do, really. So I think that's good for me. I've expressed a lot of my core insights that I've gained after 6 years of seeking spiritual enlightenment. I hope that you were able to accept some of it. I realize that a lot of these ideas go against common notions of God, and they go against what modern day science would believe. And all I can say is, if you do the practices, you'll find that what I've said here is true. But it does take some work on your part. If you want to find it the easy way, you can take a high dose of a psychedelic in a calm, safe setting, of course. And I've noticed you might want to have a trip sitter if it's your first trip. I wouldn't do a high dose experience your first trip. Work your way up to it. But I've noticed that my most spiritually significant trips have been alone, and they've been in a dark room with no music on. Just pure consciousness, essentially. You want as little to interrupt the experience as possible. So, in my opinion, that's the best way to take psychedelics for spiritual purposes. But I hope you guys got something out of this video, and I'll be making more to come. So go ahead and subscribe, and definitely give this video a thumbs up if you enjoyed it. Thanks for watching.